Hi everyone, this is Carrie Cole with Side by Side Educational Consulting, where we specialize working side by side with educators to improve outcomes for all kids. We've been working on a video series around explicit systematic phonics instruction, and today we're going to define those two terms, explicit and systematic. So, to give a little history around this, in the year 2000, the National Reading Panel report came out, and this was a meta-analysis on what are the best approaches for teaching kids to read, where we get the best results. One of the things that they found in their meta-analysis was that explicit systematic phonics instruction got better results than non-systematic instruction or no phonics instruction at all. Kids that got that type of instruction that was both explicit and systematic were better readers. Understanding that and knowing that, we look a little deeper at this because it's been replicated over and over in the years since then. We know that kids that receive this type of instruction are better readers in grades K and 1, that they're better comprehenders, that this type of instruction benefits kids no matter what their socioeconomic status is. It's a preventative approach to teaching kids to read in terms of preventing reading difficulties for kids. And for kids that do have continued reading difficulties, this approach is extremely beneficial for them and vital in helping to fill those gaps. So understanding the importance of explicit systematic instruction, it's important that we know why this instruction. So when thinking about explicit systematic instruction, we need to know what those two terms mean and how that looks in a classroom so that we can ensure that that's the type of instruction we're providing kids. So let's look at systematic first. When we think about the term systematic, there's a few things we need to understand. Number one, systematic means that there's a clearly defined scope and sequence. So when you have a clearly defined sequence, there's going to be very explicit instruction around phoneme, grapheme associations, and that sequence is going to clearly lay that out beforehand. You're going to know exactly what order you're going to introduce those sounds and how those sounds then connect to the letters or the print in our language. There's a few things to think about when you think about that idea of systematic. Number one, when it's systematic, it's not likely going to be in alphabetical order. It's fine to teach letter recognition in alphabetical order, but when you start to get into a phonics scope and sequence where you start connecting the sounds to the graphemes, you're going to be looking at a scope and sequence that's not in alphabetical order, and there's a reason for this. You want to introduce sounds that are frequent or high utility first. So you're going to be looking at sounds like spelled S, spelled M, T spelled T early on in the sequence, and then maybe a vowel sound like A spelled A. Once you have those four sounds, which are all highly, very frequent sounds in our language, you can start building words and get kids to be blending words early on. The other thing that you want to consider is thinking about how those sounds are voiced. So you're going to be thinking about whether those sounds are continuous sounds or stop sounds. Continuous sounds are sounds that can be articulated through a continuous approach, and then they're not going to be distorted at the end. So would be a continuous sound because that's a sound that can be continued and not be distorted, whereas t is a stop sound because if you tried to continue that sound on, you're going to end up with an at the end. So that's a stop sound. When you think about continuous sounds in the scope and sequence, you want to have the majority of sounds to be continuous because those are easier for kids to blend. So in that scope and sequence, it's not just about frequency, but also about ensuring that lots of those sounds at the beginning are continuous sounds because they're easier for kids to blend into words. Another thing to consider is whether those sound grapheme correspondences are going to be voiced sounds. Voiced sounds are sounds that use your voice box to articulate them. So uses your voice box, where t does not. That's a whisper sound. It's fine to introduce t in the sequence, but you want the majority of sounds to be both continuous and voiced because then kids can blend them more easily. The last thing that you need to consider in a systematic approach in that scope and sequence and the order that you introduce sound spelling correspondences is going to be widely separating those letters and sounds that are often confused. So let's think about a few of those examples. For B and D, for example, are often confused by kids. And you want to make sure that in a good phonics scope and sequence that those are widely separated and not introduced in close proximity to each other. Think about it. If you did this in alphabetical order, B and D would come very close together in the sequence. So you want to make sure that they're widely separated so kids can master one, have it down before the next one is introduced. Another example of some easily confused letters or sounds would be M and N. They look similar and they're also both nasal sounds. So you want them widely separated in the sequence as well. And again, if we were doing this in alphabetical order, M and N are right next to each other in that alphabetic sequence. So you want those widely separated. I'll give you one more example. It would be the vowel sounds, short vowel sounds of eh and I. Often very difficult for kids to discriminate between, and also in that alphabetic sequence are fairly close to one another. You want those widely separated as well. So there's lots of things to consider in a systematic approach for phonics. The order in which we are introducing sounds. There's no one approach that has been researched to be the most effective, but what you will notice when you're looking at systematic approaches to phonics is many of the scope and sequences are similar in how they're introducing those sounds because they're considering those elements of high utility. They're considering the elements of continuous and voice sounds early on in the sequence, and also making sure that easily confused letters and sounds are widely separated in the sequence. So that's systematic. When we think about explicit instruction means that we're not going to assume that kids are going to discover the connections between phonemes and graphemes on their own. We're going to be very explicit in teaching that to them and then giving them lots of opportunities. We're going to spend the majority of our time giving them lots of opportunities to practice that so they can master that at a quick rate. So when we think about explicit instruction, it really is just about really clear instruction that follows that I do, we do, you do model that we all know so well from Anita Archer. So that I do is going to be that explicit modeling, watch me do it, here's what we're working on today, watch me do it. That we do is let's practice this together. And as you're practicing it together, you're watching kids, providing feedback, ensuring that you're feeling confident that they're getting it. And then once you are confident in that we do stage, you turn it over to them, to the you do, where they're then practicing that on their own. So just to wrap this up, when you think about phonics instruction, not all phonics approaches are the same. The National Reading Panel found that an explicit, systematic approach produced the best results. You want to ensure that there's a system, a scope and sequence that's clearly defined, and you want to ensure that the instruction is explicit, that we have that clear I do, we do, you do.